I'm Dr. Keith Graham from the School of Teacher Education at National Taiwan Normal University, and I welcome you to our final video in this video series on assessing learning in EMI Classrooms, alternative grading approaches. Up until this point, we've talked about various aspects related to an EMI assessment system, including knowing how your context impacts assessment, formative learning assessment techniques you can use before, during, and after a lecture, and we've discussed the importance of feedback during the assessment process. But there is one aspect we haven't discussed that most people associate with assessment. That is grading. While you may think grading is a straightforward process, in this video, I intend to challenge some of the grading methods we've traditionally used and suggest alternative grading approaches that I believe are a better fit for the challenges EMI presents. But before I do that, I'd like to return once again to our two categories of assessment. As I'm sure you recall from previous videos, we can think about assessment in terms of two categories: formative assessment and summative assessment. I talked about formative assessment in detail in the third video of this series. And one of the things I tried to emphasize was that I don't believe grades should be taken during formative assessment. I made an analogy using a basketball player, discussing how we don't judge the player on their practice. We only judge them on their performance during a game. And I believe the same should apply to our classrooms. We should provide students with an adequate amount of time for practicing and receiving feedback before we take a grade. With that in mind, grading will typically be done during summative assessments, the assessments taken during key points of the course, such as the end of a unit or at the midterm or final. Why? Because the main purpose of a summative assessment is to inform stakeholders on the final outcome of student learning. And grades have been the traditional means for informing on outcomes. But one question we need to ask is, how well does a final score or letter grade inform stakeholders on student learning? Does the way we traditionally calculate grades reflect students' ultimate learning attainment, or does that attainment get lost within a mathematical average? To examine this question, let's take a look at an example I adapted from Clark and Talbert's 2023 book, Grading for Growth. On your screen, you see the gradebook entries for two students, Alice and Bob. In this example course, students engaged in three summative assessments: midterm 1, which covered the first third of the course; midterm 2, which covered the second third of the course; and a cumulative final, which measured all learning outcomes throughout the course. Before I break down this grading table further, I'd like you to pause the video and ask yourself, how would you describe the performance of these students? Hopefully, you've taken the time to process this table. I'm now going to dissect this table from the perspective of reporting final learning outcomes of a student to a stakeholder. Generally speaking, a stakeholder will only see some representation of the last column of this table. So let's start there. We can see that both Alice and Bob earned a total of 240 points in the course, which is 60% of the total points possible. So we would expect that a university transcript would either show 60% or a D or D minus, depending on the university's conversion scale. As a stakeholder, my takeaway would be that Alice and Bob are more or less the same in terms of their learning outcomes in this course. But is that actually the case? To answer this question, we would have to examine other columns of the table, and specifically the cumulative final, because that provides us with the final snapshot of learning across the whole course. As you can see, Alice and Bob are in fact not the same in terms of their final learning outcomes. Bob scored 120 out of 200, which turns out is 60%, the same as his total score. In the case of Bob, the grade provided to stakeholders fairly accurately depicted Bob's understanding of the course. But Alice is a completely different story. She scored 180 out of 200, suggesting she has an understanding of about 90% of the course. But stakeholders would never know that. because her final total indicated she only understood about 60% of the course. Unfortunately, Alice was a victim of the average. Her low scores on midterm 1 and 2 hid the fact that she performed fairly well on the final. If you believe, like I do, that final scores should inform stakeholders on final learning attainment of a student at the end of a course, then you can see with the case of Alice why our traditional practice of using averaging for grading is problematic. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, if Alice did better at the beginning of the term, she wouldn't have this problem. This, of course, is true. But let's consider some reasons why she might have performed poorly in the beginning, assuming that this course was an EMI course. For many of our students, our EMI course could be their first time learning our subject through English. And we know from research in other contexts that those with previous EMI experience tend to perform better than those without. In the case of Alice, it could be that this was her first time taking an EMI course, and that it took her the better part of the semester to get acclimated to that. Her earlier grades may be more of a reflection of lack of EMI experience rather than lack of content knowledge. Now, in the case of Alice, although it didn't work out for her final grade, she should be commended for persevering and eventually overcoming her initial challenges with EMI. But I'm going to guess that such an outcome would be unlikely in reality. What's more realistic is that a student receiving a failing grade on the final midterm would realize in a traditional grading system that there is no overcoming that in a system of averages, and they would drop the EMI course. The consequences of such action for the student's future would vary, but it's worth asking whether that's really the effect we want from our grading system. For me, it's not. So I've spent time reflecting about this problem of grading, particularly within the context of EMI, and I've learned there are several alternative grading options that can more accurately and fairly represent the learning outcomes of our students. Those alternatives include standard-based grading, specifications grading, and ungrading. I'll share more details about each of these approaches to grading in a moment and help you understand which approach is most appropriate for which type of course. But first, I want to share with you what Clark and Talbert call the 4 pillars of alternative grading. The first pillar is clearly defined standards. One of the key distinctions between traditional and alternative approaches is that traditional grades are often calculated based on the number of questions you answer correctly, whereas alternative approaches base grades on how many standards the student demonstrates, or what you may refer to as objectives or outcomes. The second pillar is helpful feedback. We discussed feedback in the previous video of this series, but in alternative grading approaches, feedback becomes especially important because it is feedback that drives students who initially don't meet a standard to eventually demonstrate understanding. The third pillar is marks indicate progress. Essentially, this pillar is the Alice problem. One of the main reasons for choosing an alternative grading approach over the traditional approach is that the final grade is more likely to reflect the culmination of learning throughout the semester, rather than mathematical averaging. Proponents of alternative grading approaches feel most strongly about this point because they want to provide stakeholders with the most accurate information on a student's learning at the completion of a course. The final pillar is reattempts without penalty. In alternative grading systems, students will have multiple chances to showcase understanding of a standard. In our previous example with Alice and Bob, the course naturally incorporated a reattempt by having a cumulative final, inclusive of all standards in the course. But unfortunately, it wasn't without penalty, because specifically in the case of Alice, even though she was successful on this so-called reattempt, she was still penalized for not showing understanding of the standards at an earlier time in the course. Each of the 3 alternative grading systems here are compatible with the 4 pillars, but they may achieve these pillars in different ways in response to different course types and formats. We're now going to take a look at each of these systems, focusing on how to implement them and which types of course they fit best with. The first alternative grading system is standard-based grading. Standard-based grading fits best with courses that target discrete skills. If your course typically uses traditional tests to measure students' abilities to solve problems or demonstrate individual skills, then standards-based grading would probably be the best choice. To give you a concrete example of standard-based grading, let's consider a made-up course called Basketball 101. In this course, students must demonstrate several discrete or isolated skills. These include dribbling the ball, passing, receiving, and doing a layup. Instead of giving a numerical score for each of these, for example, 90% out of 100 for dribbling the basketball, the gradebook would simply indicate whether a student met or didn't meet the standard. The final grade would be based on the number of standards a student met. For example, if a student met all 4 standards, they would receive an A in the course. 3 standards, a B, 2, a C, and so forth. From this simple example, you can see how standards-based grading can satisfy each of the 4 pillars. Our Basketball 101 course has clearly defined standards, dribble, pass, layup, etc. We can assume throughout the course, when a student tries to demonstrate, for example, dribbling, that the instructor will provide helpful feedback so that the student can improve their dribbling skills. In standard-based grading, marks very clearly align with progress, since the number of standards met directly translates to a grade. You can feel confident that your grades at the end of a course truly represent students' final abilities. And finally, while standards-based grading doesn't inherently include reattempts, it is upon the instructor to schedule the course in a manner that students can have multiple attempts at demonstrating a standard. Many instructors may find that last pillar, reattempts without penalty, a bit daunting, but it doesn't have to be. If your course uses a traditional test format, then all you have to do is make sure that each test includes questions for each standard. Alternatively, there are ways that you can leverage your pre-scheduled office hours to easily facilitate reattempts. If you would like to learn more about ways to manage reattempts, I would recommend checking out the book Grading for Growth. There is also an online blog with the same name that provides a lot of ideas for managing reattempts in various types of courses. Let's now move to our next alternative grading system, specifications grading. Specifications grading is best for courses where the assessments require multiple skills to complete a task. Instead of grades being based on discrete skills, like with standards-based grading, grades in a specifications grading system reflect a student having passed various assignments where multiple skills are demonstrated. If your course assessments typically include projects or presentations, then specifications grading would probably be a good fit with your course. Let's now look at how specifications grading works through another example course we'll call Basketball 102. Instead of focusing on discrete basketball skills like our previous example, Basketball 101, the Basketball 102 course will utilize a series of assignments where students have to execute plays. To successfully pass each of these plays, the students will have to use a combination of the discrete skills demonstrated in Basketball 101. So let's take a look at one of these assignments, the layup play, as an example of the way specifications grading works at the assignment level. As you can see, assignment 1 has 5 requirements: dribble the ball, pass the ball, receive a pass, do the layup, and make sure the ball actually goes in the basket. These requirements are called specifications in this system. Assignments are graded simply as pass or no pass. There are no number or letter grades involved. To receive a pass, a student has to demonstrate all specifications. For example, if the student in Basketball 102 did everything except specification 5, getting the ball in the basket, then the student would receive a no pass for that attempt. But remember that the 4th pillar of alternative grading is reattempts without penalty. So the student should have multiple opportunities to receive a pass for the assessment. Each assignment in a specifications graded course will have a list of specifications that must be met to receive a pass. At the end of the semester, grades are determined by the number of assignments passed. So, in the case of our Basketball 102 course, if a student passed 4 assignments, then they receive an A, 3 assignments, a B, and so on. If students do not demonstrate each specification by the semester's end, then that assignment remains a no pass. As hopefully is evident, specifications grading meets all the pillars of alternative grading. Standards are defined through assignment specifications. Helpful feedback is provided after each attempt, specifically in terms of the specifications met or not met within the assignment. Marks indicate progress since they are tied to the number of assignments successfully passed, and reattempts are incorporated throughout the course. The example I provided of specifications grading is the most basic one. However, there are many other variations that you may want to consider. If you are interested in learning more about how to implement specifications grading, I recommend the book by Linda Nilsson, aptly titled Specifications Grading. The final alternative grading system I will introduce in this video is ungrading. Ungrading is good for courses that use portfolio work for evaluations. For example, writing composition classes and perhaps classes in the arts. However, it is also the most controversial of the three because if it is not implemented with the 4 pillars in mind, specifically Pillar 1, clearly defined standards, then the final grade could potentially be seen as arbitrary and subject to bias. Let's take a look at ungrading through another basketball course example, Basketball 401. Ungrading can be practiced in many ways, but typically the grading scheme is set up with descriptors for each final grade level. Here we have an example descriptor of an A-level student. I encourage you to pause the video and read the descriptor on your own. Now, it is worth noting that you should have a descriptor for each grade, not just the A level. But here we'll just focus on one. You can see that this descriptor for A-level work does contain various objective standards like we've seen with the other 2 grading approaches. But it also leaves some room for subjectivity and discussion. This is intentional because the final grade in ungrading is not determined solely by the instructor. The student is also involved in determining the final grade. Throughout the semester, students will compile a portfolio of work. In the case of our Basketball 401 course, this will likely be composed of various video clips from multiple in-game performances that provide evidence of achievement in relation to the grade descriptors. At the end of the semester, students will present their portfolio to the instructor and make a case for the grade they deserve in the course. During their presentation, they must reference the grade level descriptor and provide evidence for each of its elements. After the student's presentation, the instructor can accept the proposed grade or propose a different grade, either higher or lower, again, using the descriptor and the portfolio as justification. Ideally, at the end of this discussion, both instructor and student are in agreement about the appropriate final grade. Proponents of ungrading celebrate the fact that students take ownership of the grading process and have to engage in higher level thinking skills to evaluate their performance. However, it is critical that the ungrading system adhere to the 4 pillars. First, there must be clearly written descriptors for each grade. Some instructors using ungrading skip this pillar, and the result is that neither student nor instructor can strongly justify to stakeholders why a grade was given and what that grade means. Second, for the ungrading process to work, students must be engaging in similar work, for example, essay writing or performance, and must be receiving feedback on that work. For example, perhaps a student writes an essay at the beginning of the semester that resembles the descriptor for C-level work. That student should receive feedback to help them know what they should do differently on the next essay to better showcase B or A-level work. Third, marks in ungrading should indicate performance level, but this is only possible if the ungrading system has very clear descriptors for each grade level. Failure to do this will render the marks largely meaningless. Finally, ungrading is only appropriate in courses where students will have multiple chances to demonstrate skills through a portfolio. Essentially, the reattempts are a product of the number of assignments that make up the portfolio. So it is important to recognize that ungrading is not compatible with every course. If you think ungrading might be a good fit for your course, you can learn about this alternative grading approach in Susan Bloom's edited volume titled Ungrading. You now have been introduced to 3 different alternative grading approaches that can be used in an EMI class. But before we leave the video, I'd like to revisit the Alice and Bob scenario, but from the lens of alternative grading. On your screen, we have a table with yeses and nos, which indicate whether a concept was met or an assignment was passed. Next to some of these yeses are asterisks, indicating that the concept or assignment was passed after a reattempt, the 4th pillar of alternative grading. We can see the outcome for Bob is very similar to our original example. Bob originally showed understanding of 60% of the course, and he has similarly done the same here. However, the implementation of alternative grading arguably provided a more accurate and equitable outcome. Although Alice was slow to adjust to EMI, she had opportunities for reattempts on concepts 1 and 3. Therefore, her EMI adjustment period did not negatively impact her final grade. By the end of the course, she was able to demonstrate knowledge in each of the course concepts. And her final grade accurately showcases that for stakeholders. Ultimately, given all of the external factors outside of course content that can impact a student's performance in an EMI course, I think using alternative grading practices in EMI is the most equitable choice. And I encourage you to consider making the switch in your courses. And on that note, we have come to the end of our series on assessing learning in EMI classrooms. I hope you found the series useful as a guide for building an assessment system for your EMI course. If you have any questions about this video or any video in the series, feel free to contact me by email at kmgraham@ntnu.edu.tw. I wish you the best of luck with your EMI courses.